is, it's a total new perspective on that. It's like I had our kids for a couple weeks, and I'm calling my mother and say, thank you for all that you did. This is a lot of work. So I appreciate my parents a lot more now that I have kids. Some jokes here. A boy said, Daddy, Daddy, I want to get married. The father says, for that, son, you have to have a boy and a girl. The son says, I found a girl. Who? My grandmother. Let me get this straight, the father says. You want to marry my mother? You can't do that. Well, why not? The son says, you married mine. Okay. A young man was walking through a supermarket to pick up a few things when he noticed an old lady following him around. Thinking nothing of it, he ignored her and continued on. Finally, he went to the checkout line, but she got in front of him. Pardon me, she said. I'm sorry if my staring at you has made you feel uncomfortable. It's just that you look like my son, who just died recently. I'm very sorry, replied the young man. Is there anything I can do for you? Yes, she said. As I'm leaving, can you say, goodbye, Mother? It would make me feel so much better. Sure, answered the young man. As the old woman was leaving, he called out, goodbye, Mother. As he stepped up to the checkout counter, he saw that his total was $127.50. How can that be, he asked. I only purchased a few things. Your mother said that you would pay for her, said the clerk. Okay, these are some Mom's Dictionary here. I just have a couple of these. Family planning, the art of spacing your children the proper distance apart to keep you on the edge of financial disaster. Feedback, the inevitable result when your baby doesn't appreciate the strained carrots. When the Winsteads lived with me, Ryan and Chloe, they were born and they were there, and Chloe had, what do they call it? Happy puking or something. So it was just like she'd just throw up and just smile, and I don't know why. It was just, she'd just do it all the time. So I was very careful if I ever held her that I held away and had a blanket there, and just makes life a little more interesting when you never know. For no reason, they just throw up there. Full name, what you call your child when you're mad at him. Grandparents, the people who think your children are wonderful even though they're sure you're not raising them right. Independent, how we want our children to be as long as they do everything we say. Puddle, a small body of water that draws other small bodies wearing dry shoes into it. The kid just did it the other day. Brooke had waders on, so she had a puddle, so she's fine, so she goes over there. The other two didn't exactly have shoes that were, so they all followed Brooke and started stamping in the water and all their shoes wet. But show off, a child who is more talented than yours. Sterilize, what you do to your first baby's pacifier by boiling it and to your last baby's pacifier by blowing on it. Top bunk, where you should never put a child wearing Superman pajamas. 2-minute warning, when the baby's face turns red and she begins to make those familiar grunting noises. Verbal, about to whine in words, able to whine in words. And who done it? None of the kids that live in your house. All right, last one here, just some kitchen signs here. So this isn't home sweet home. Adjust. Martha Stewart doesn't live here. Ring bell for maid service. If no answer, do it yourself. I clean house every other day. Today is the other day. If you write it in the dust, please don't date it. I would cook dinner, but I can't find the can opener. My house was clean last week. Too bad you missed it. I came, I saw, I decided to order takeout. If you don't like my standards of cooking, lower your standards. Although you'll find our house a mess, it doesn't always look like this. Some days it's even worse. A messy kitchen is a happy kitchen, and this kitchen is delirious. A balanced diet is a cookie in each hand. Thou shalt not weigh more than the refrigerator. Blessed are they who can laugh at themselves, for they shall never cease to be amused. Countless number of people have eaten in this kitchen and gone on to lead normal lives. My next house will have no kitchen, just vending machines. And last one, I've lived life in the fast lane. I'd live life in the fast lane, but I'm married to a speed bump. Okay. All right, happy Mother's Day. We appreciate you guys. We're starting a new series here. We're starting on David, and really it's about leadership with David. It's not the life of David. It's more some leadership principles from the life of David. David's an interesting guy. I love David. I love his life, and you can learn from what he did right and learn from his mistakes as well. But he was loved by his friends, a lot of loyal people with him, and hated by his enemies. And he's a great example of leadership in history. And when we look at him, he is actually one of the most written about people in the Bible. I mean, besides Jesus, the Bible gives more space to the life of David than any other character. Abraham and Joseph get 14 chapters. Jacob gets 11 chapters. Elijah 10. However, David has 66 chapters about him. Okay, and that doesn't even include 70-some Psalms and 59 references in the New Testament. David's name is found 1,120 times in Scripture. Okay, so it would be a huge study if we just studied the complete life of David. So we're just doing a few lessons over his leadership, some principles. He's a man that said the man after God's own heart. And that's something, God doesn't say about anybody else. And, something we can learn from somebody that has that close relationship with God. So it's a springboard to leadership. And we're going to look at his life, his heart, his humility, his courage, his solitude, and his organizational efforts, and learn some leadership qualities here. Before we get into David, the name of this lesson is Before There Was a David. We're going to look at before he was born, some of his family history regarding Ruth, and realize David's life was planned before he was born. God was at work through his great-grandmother Ruth and his great-grandfather Boaz many years before David's birth, and God's been working our lives too. Okay, there's a bunch of things that have brought us to this point, where they're getting saved and being in church, and, God's done miracles. Many years ago when Pastor Lee was alive, he's the one who started a church in a Center Road Baptist Church, and he went door knocking, and he led my grandmother to the Lord, and she was a Catholic, and my mother got saved through that. And every time I see the guy, I think, I wouldn't be here without that guy. Without that guy leading my grandmother to the Lord, dedicating his life and sacrificing, and amazing man. And then my grandmother got saved and had her kids in church, and the influence of my grandmother to keep her kids in church. My mother wouldn't have gone to Bible college, wouldn't have met my dad. And, realize that God has a plan. And when we look back, every time I look at that man, and I thought, I wouldn't be here without him. And I don't know how many, there's countless people that he's affected that wouldn't be in church, and I don't know where, I wouldn't be alive. I don't know how that all works, but, I just blessings because of that man, and God had a plan, and he answered God's call, and it makes me think about that every time God's working. So important idea we're going to get out of this, we are all important to God. He's been working in your life since you were born, and we may not realize it, and sometimes you do, and you see things fit together, and you see things you didn't understand why, and then it makes sense later on. Sometimes we'll never know, but realize God's working on your life. I don't know how people live that are atheistic and don't believe in God, and there's no plan, there's no purpose, and we're all accidents, and there's no meaning to life. When we look at God, and He's got a master plan, He knows the future, and He's in control. And we're going to look at some things like that about David. But you probably heard the example of if I brought chocolate chip cookies. If I brought the ingredients, I thought about bringing them, but I'm like, I don't think Pastor would like me bringing raw eggs and flour and salt and all that into the auditorium. But most of us know the ingredients to make a cookie. And if I said, come on up and, eat this flour or eat this salt, and you'd say, this is disgusting. I'm not doing that, when we have one ingredients by themselves. But, all those ingredients aren't real appetizing. I guess the only one is the chocolate chips that you would eat by yourself. My wife has a little stash in there, and then when she's not looking, I empty the bag in there and steal a few. But that's probably the only ingredient we'll eat by itself. But when you combine it, they're wonderful, okay? Chocolate chips, if I had cookies, if I had them here, I know I'd be signing up for those. But when we combine them, they're wonderful things. And really that's life. We have things happen and we wonder, this wasn't good, why did this happen? And then when we see the overall, when it all comes together and we see that, it just gives us a different perspective. And we're going to look at David's life today from this perspective. What ingredients did God use to prepare him for service? And we're going to go back and look at the life of Ruth real quick. And I'll just give a brief summary. There's a lot of providences that led Ruth to, we know she's in the lineage of David. Okay, we know she's in the lineage of Jesus. But how did that lead there? And some things that happened. First, we know there's a famine in the land. Okay, they had a famine, no food. We really don't understand that in America. We're so blessed and shelves stocked, but can you imagine if there's just no food and just, that basic necessity of life, and they didn't know what to do, and a decision was made. Elimelech and Naomi, they decided to move to Moab with their sons. Okay, that's a big deal. You're trying to survive. People are dying. We like I said, we're so blessed. Read about communist China and what they did. I read a book about communist, the name is escaping me. The Khmer Rouge. What country is that? Cambodia, yes, Cambodia. And oh man, when the communists came in and it was just people murdered, died of starvation, and it was just heart-wrenching to see why they're trying to flee into Thailand, and Thailand's kicking them out, and they're just trying to get food and anything they can to survive, and we really don't understand that. But there's a famine. He makes a decision, goes to Moab. While he's there, Elimelech dies, and then later on, there's her two sons, Naomi's two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, die also. So we see all these factors that happen. I mean, can you imagine poor Naomi going to this country? You don't know anybody. It's pretty much a foreign land. And then your husband and your two sons that would be taking care of you die. And they don't have, we take for granted the social welfare system that we have. They don't have life insurance. They don't, they don't have all those things. So she's over there, and she talks to Ruth, and also to her other daughter-in-law, Orpah. I keep thinking Oprah every time I see that and I read it. I don't know if I'm the only one, but he makes a choice. He says, I don't have any more sons for you. You need to stay here. Don't follow me. And Orpah stays there, and Naomi follows her. And turn to Ruth chapter 1. I like what she says here. Ruth chapter 1, verse 15 says, "And she said, Behold, thy sister-in-law is gone back under her people and unto her gods. Return thou after thy sister-in-law. And Ruth said, Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and whither thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest will I die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me." And this is an amazing statement that she's making here. I am going to follow you. I'm going to take care of you. I'm not going to leave you. I am going to leave my family and everything I'm familiar with and my homeland, and I'm going to take care of you. That she must have realized she had something special with the God of the Bible, and she said, I'm going to follow your God. And it was an amazing choice, a huge choice, life-changing. Do I stay here? And she probably would have been taken care of by her family and her in-laws and relatives, and she's going to this strange land with her mother-in-law. So she makes the choice. I turn to Ruth chapter 2. I like what Boaz says, and he notices this and comments on it in Ruth chapter 2. Verse 11 says, "And Boaz answered and said unto her, It hath been fully showed me all that thou hast done unto thy mother-in-law since the death of thine husband, and how thou hast left thy father and thy mother and the land of thy nativity, and art come unto a people which thou knewest not heretofore. The Lord recompense thy work, and a full reward be given thee of the Lord God of Israel, unto whose wing thou art come to trust. And he notices, and he's commenting, and he says, I've been told what you did and how you took care of her and how you left your parents and your homeland and everything you knew, and you agreed to take care of her, and you're trusting God. And she made a huge choice, and she made a choice to trust God, and you're going to see the benefits of that in the generations to come. And sometimes we make decisions and we may not see, well, why'd you do that? That didn't make sense, And God's blessing, not just us, but, the future generations to come. So they're back in the homeland there, where Naomi's from, in Israel, and they have to harvest a field of grain. And Naomi must have suggested gleaning in Boaz's field, so she does what her mother says. She starts gleaning there, and they have a chance meeting. Boaz sees Ruth and is interested in her. And they, obviously, you read it. I'm not going to read the whole thing. There's a developing romance there, an acceptance of proposal. You kind of see the women kind of engineered the whole thing. I know they're like, oh, they have arranged marriages, and they do. But I think the women have a little say in it still. I think the mothers have a say, and I think, I don't think. Totally. I think the mother would say, I don't want to marry that guy. I think she'd tell her mother. I think the mother would put pressure on the father. I think there's I still think the ladies had some say here, but you can see how Naomi and Ruth kind of set it up and worked things out. And I had a guy deacon used to say, women allow themselves to be caught, okay? And that's kind of what they did, and they kind of set things in motion with Boaz. And we see there's a refusal to marry. If you study the law, we're going to look at it a little more, but the near kinsman had a right, and they went to him, and he refused. And then we see a boy's birth, Obed is born. And we see a lot of factors that, could have gone differently, a lot of choices. And I really think God was in control, and God's planning, God knew, and God allowed all these things to happen, and they worked together for good. So let's look at some of the things. What if they didn't happen? And I think it's interesting. I look at my own life, and I think, what if I had married this other person and not my wife? What if I had done this? And God, I think He, allowed things and allowed things to happen so I would find the right person. And I believe my wife is absolutely the perfect person for me. And He knew ahead. He knew before that I would be teaching in the school, and I never would have thought I'd be a principal or teaching in the school. And my wife has a teaching degree, and all her parents have run Christian schools and Christian colleges, and God knew exactly what I needed, and He worked things out. And I look back, and all the pieces fit together. At the time, it's depressing, like, why didn't this relationship work out, and why didn't this happen? Why am I still single, But He knows, and He's got it all planned. It's neat to see all the puzzle pieces, and then she wasn't ready. She's a few years younger. God had to give her time to mature and graduate college. And, and then you're like, well, it couldn't have happened earlier. It had to happen at this time, and it all worked together. And just a bunch of factors. When we were first met, they came. She was in a singing group, and they were. My cousin had gone to the college, Jessica, and they had them over, and they invited me over conveniently. It's very nice of them. They're trying to set me up, and it was after the meeting. It was the last time. They're getting ready to go, and then they're all in the living room. And everybody went to Jessica's bedroom. I'm like, I'm not going in there with a bunch of girls I don't know, So I'm like, I gotta go. I gotta leave. This is it. I'm not going to get to talk to her. I'll never get to see her again. And she said, something told me just to go out in the living room and go talk to him. And she came out, and she's like, I'm going to go get a drink of water. And I thought it was all done. I was getting my shoes on, ready to leave. And I thought, I'll never see her again. This is it. And she came out. She was in the living room. And I was able to ask, could I keep in contact with you? And she said yes. She said, of course, and gave me her number. No. And, things worked out. But it was like we look back and we think, man, if you wouldn't have walked into that living room at that time, I never would have seen you again. And that would have been it. And I think God, allowed things, and He's in control, and He's planning things. And, we look back and what if this happened? But what if that happened? What if this didn't happen? we wouldn't be here, or she wouldn't be here, we wouldn't have our kids. And it's just interesting to think about. So what if the famine had never occurred? Okay, so that's the major factor that allowed, Ruth to come back to Israel. And nearly all the time when you look in the Bible, famine is a sign of displeasure of God with his people, with the nation. And really, he promises fertility, abundance as a sign of his favor. You look in the Bible. And famine in Canaan drove Abraham to Egypt. Famine in Canaan drove Isaac to Egypt. A famine in Joseph's day brought his brothers to Egypt. And a famine in Ruth's day, obviously we know, brought Elimelech and his family to Moab. A 3-year famine in David's day was brought on because of Saul's sin. Okay, and 3-year famine, what did Saul do? He killed the Gibeonites. And God said, you're going to pay for that. And he sent a famine. And David said, what do I have to do? What happened? And he told him he had to kill some of Saul's sons. And that's what he did. And God took that curse off of him and got rid of the famine. Elijah calls for a 3-year famine during the wicked reign of Ahab. Famines are mentioned many times by prophets as God's punishment. Okay, so I don't know the reason for this famine, but usually it wasn't, God was causing it on purpose, and usually as judgment. So what if the famine hadn't happened? What if Elimelech hadn't decided to go to Moab? Okay, I'm sure a lot of people said, don't go to Moab. Okay, that's a bad idea. That's, just a different nation. We don't want to mix with them. So people told him not to go, but he went anyway. What if Elimelech hadn't died? Okay, that would have changed the whole story. They never would have moved back to Israel, probably. He might not allow his sons to marry Moabite women. Okay, and this is the law. Interesting, some history regarding marriage. Marriage is ordained of God. Hebrew men were forbidden to marry women of the original nations in Canaan. Okay, anybody name the original nations? The Perizzites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, and the Jebusites. Okay, so they were the original ones. God forbid to marry them. Marriage to women from nations outside of Israel, like Moab, were legal, but not considered wise. Okay, so they were allowed, but they were really kind of frowned upon. They were still legal. Nehemiah talks about that. He talks about mixed marriages, and he kind of condemns that, but they were allowed. And then there was a special custom, it's called levirate. I'm probably not saying that right, but that's a custom where in Ruth's day, when a married man died without a child, his next of kin was expected to take his wife. Okay, I'm dealing with this sloped thing here. So that was and the reason for that was they still had a choice. They could refuse, but the reason was to provide protection for the widow and her children. Okay, it was a way to help them. They didn't have all the government that we have today to take care of people, so they had this custom to take care of them. So what if that hadn't happened? What if Mahlon hadn't married anyone other than Ruth? What if Mahlon and Chilion had not died while Ruth was still young? Okay, what if he'd lived longer and died later on? Would she have left? What if Ruth had taken Naomi's advice and stayed in Moab like Orpah? Okay, she's very sternly said, you need to stay, and the other sister-in-law stayed, and she didn't listen to her, and she followed Naomi. What if Ruth had not gleaned or had gleaned in someone else's field? Okay, see all these factors that come together and allowed Ruth and Boaz to get married, and the lineage of David, and God's working. I'll say this about gleaning and harvesting. Okay, interesting thing. During harvest, there are three types of laborers. They're the harvesters, the binders, and the gleaners. The harvesters are reapers. Obviously, they're the ones that are paid to cut down the wheat or grapes or olives for the landlord. They're paid workers. Binders are also paid. They're, obviously binding the sheaves together. And then the gleaners were beggars, poor orphans, strangers, who followed the harvesters and gleaned the loose grain. So what they were told was they couldn't cut the corners of the field. Okay, they had to leave that for the poor. And then if they dropped anything, they weren't allowed to pick it up, and it was for the poor. And I it's interesting. We struggle with what social welfare programs, and God cares about the poor. He wants to help them. I think it's interesting they had to do what? They had to work for it still, didn't they? Okay, there's big debate right now is should we make people work, that are for welfare? And people are like, no way. And you look at the able-bodied men between 20 and 30 and they don't have a job and they don't want to work for any benefits. And you see here in the Bible it says they had to work, but they were provided for. And it's just interesting. I had a young person wanting to go to Trinidad, and he wants money. He doesn't have a job. He's 16, and somebody was willing to give money, and so we're having him work for it. And he's helping at the church. I'm getting things done at the church, which is great because I'm getting old, and he's cleaning up the church and doing things. But he's working for it, and they're giving money. They donate it, and it's such a great way. And there's a sense of fulfillment that, hey, I worked for this, and it was provided, and we're giving him a way to do it, picking him up, bringing somebody's donating money to pay him, and there's a sense of fulfillment when you're working for something. And so you see here they had a system, gleaning, where they could, if they're poor, widows, orphans, they could go and get grain and be taken care of. We see here with Ruth, Boaz sees her, and what does he tell his servants? Leave her extra, okay? Drop some in front of her, make her life easier, take care of her. Obviously, he was smitten by her. So what if that hadn't happened? What if he'd gleaned in another field? What if Ruth and Naomi had not decided to ask Boaz to marry Ruth? What if the nearest kinsman had married Ruth instead? Okay, think about that. She must have been a very attractive lady, okay, if Boaz notices her and is smitten with her, and he said, no, I don't want to take her. He said, it would ruin my inheritance. What if Boaz had not accepted Ruth's proposal? What if Boaz and Ruth had no sons? There's a bunch of factors here. You can see God working, allowing things to happen, and God has a plan, and she just stayed faithful. She just chose to serve God and help her mother-in-law and do the right thing. And you see the blessings that God had and what came from that. And we see David wouldn't have come along, okay? David wouldn't have happened. David wouldn't have been born. And we see 3 generations later, God tells Samuel, it says, fill thine horn with oil and go, and I will send thee to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided me a king among his sons. What's God saying there? He's provided, okay? He's allowed this to happen. He had a plan, and he set it all up, and this is the one I have provided, okay? It's not, who should I pick? And, just randomly pick that person. No, he picked David on purpose, and he'd set it up. He had a plan. God works in our lives before we are born. Okay, it's a great thing to think of. God cares about us. Sometimes we get depressed and we think nobody cares about us, nobody loves us. God has a plan, and He's got a plan for our life. Before we were even born, He's got it all figured out. The book of Ruth is a record of God's providence in David's life. He worked in David's life before he was born. And even your great-grandmother and great-great-grandmother are part of your destiny. Okay, nothing happens by accident. I think about it all the time, my grandmother, and just that influence. Maybe there was somebody in your life that allowed you to be raised in a Christian home or brought you to Christ or had an influence in your life. And that wasn't an accident. That was on purpose. And so think about that. We may never know in our lifetime how God is using us. Okay, sometimes we think we serve, we're faithful, and we don't see anything come from that. Well, David got on the throne. His great-grandparents were gone. Boaz and Ruth, they weren't alive. They didn't see that happen. They didn't know the fruits of their faithfulness and their love of God and the choices they made. They didn't get to see that their great-grandson on the throne. And sometimes we won't see it. And I like when I see families of pastors and you see second, third generations and the choices that the grandfather made, and then the grandkids are serving God, and there's blessings there because of choices made before them. And David didn't realize how greatly God would use him either. He was the youngest of 8 sons. Okay, that means he didn't receive the inheritance. That went to the oldest. And in their culture, he was the least important. Okay, think about that. As they go down the line, you become less and less important. And that's why when Samuel came to visit Bethlehem, Jesse's sons, he had his 7 sons. David wasn't even there. He said, get all your sons. They didn't even think of David. Okay, they didn't even think of bringing him. And he's got to ask, do you have any more sons? Okay, and they're like, yeah, David. Yeah, I guess once you get that many, you start to lose track. I don't know. But think about that. You know, one of your sons is going to be king, and they bring all your sons, and you don't even remember this one son. And then the guy's got to remind you. Samuel reminds him, is there any other ones? You got any more? Yeah. Oh, yeah, somebody go get, we didn't even think to invite him. Okay, he's out watching the sheep, which is the lowliest job, and he never realized what was in store for him. And you know, we don't realize what ordinary things are happening in our lives today are preparing us for great things tomorrow, okay? We just, you know, stay faithful. Keep doing those little things, and you don't know where they're going to lead and what can happen. And look at Brother B.A. and you know, your faithfulness many years ago, and you know, chose to get saved and follow God, and you got grandkids in church, you know, and just the blessings, generations, and you never realized, I don't know how many years ago you got saved, I won't say. 40 years ago, did you realize all these blessings would happen and you'd be in church, your grandchildren would be in church, and the impact of your son and their family on people's lives, and you just never realize those things, but you just stay faithful and stay faithful. So why it's important to give our best in everything we do. We're preparing for the future. David did his best. Whatever job it was, he did his best. You could trust him. And I look at, you know, we know he slew the lion and the bear, and this guy took his job seriously. I do not think I would probably be shuffling one sheep off and saying, you know, here's a little, you know, it's better the sheep than my life. You know, honestly, I'm not going up against a bear. Funny story, we all know David with the slingshot, right? And I just read in Alpena, Michigan, which is a few minutes from where my wife used to live, this guy tried to abduct this girl, came out of the woods, and this 14-year-old boy grabbed his slingshot, ran out there and hit the guy in the head. Okay, the guy let go, and then he got him in the gut, and the guy ran away. And they ended up catching him, and one of the things they could tell was he had marks where he'd been hit by this kid with a slingshot. I know it's not the actual weapon of war they use, is way different than the ones we know as slingshots, but I just thought that was amazing. The police were amazed that this 14-year-old kid had the presence of mind to get a slingshot, run out, and nails the guy in the head. I mean, that's pretty amazing, and saves his sister's life. I mean, or you don't know what would have happened, but I just thought that was amazing that this kid, you know, fight a bear without a weapon, without a gun. If I had a gun, I'd probably, you know, be worried, but without a, you know, with a staff, and he's fighting a lion. He took his job seriously, and it was important. He did his best at everything, prepared him for the future. Even our common and ordinary decisions are spiritually or divinely blessed. And we see here Ruth, Boaz, they didn't know prophecy was being fulfilled, or there was great spiritual things going on, and they were just living their lives trying to make the best decisions. They never realized their marriage was linked to a divine plan. Ruth never realized that just gleaning in the field would lead to that. And just these little things that we do, we don't realize the impact that they may have later on. And that in her lineage should be a future king in her lineage, and also the Messiah, Jesus Christ. If you follow that, you know, Jesus is the line of David. They call him Son of David. And nothing happens by accident in our lives. With a Christian, every event is holy. And just your faithfulness, just your showing up, just your, you know, you don't know that impact. And I see people and they get away from church, and you know, and they have young kids, and then they get right and come back when the kids start going crazy and just getting in the world, and you know, it's too late for those kids, and it's just like that impact. And I'm thinking, just the faithfulness, just coming to church, showing up, faithfulness, faithfully doing something has an impact. And we may not realize that in our lives, our kids, our grandkids, but it has an impact. Next one is, God blesses those who live honorably, responsibly, and with integrity and character. Those who don't fade into insignificance. And we look at this story, we know Ruth's got her own book, okay, in the Bible. We were a famous story. She acted honorably, responsibly, with integrity, became a part of redemptive history. Elimelech, Mahlon, Chilion, and Orpah acted in self-interest and faded from history. Okay, the only reason we really know these people is from the story of Ruth. But do we ever talk about Mahlon and Chilion? Or, they didn't do anything great here, but we see they faded from history. But Ruth will always be known. Okay, Ruth will always be known as in the line of David, in the line of Jesus. And she's honored 3,000 years later, the ancestry of Jesus. Those other ones, they're really into obscurity. Okay, we don't really talk much about them. Just a footnote in history. And it's important to live righteously and honorably. Only those who please the Lord will be used by Him. Important lesson in leadership: if God is to use us, we must live honorably and holy, even in the ordinary events of life. And just the key is stay faithful, stay faithful, stay faithful. Trust God. And you see Naomi did that, and she cared about others. She cared about the God, the God of the Bible, and she did right, and God blessed her, and those other ones faded off. Okay, they're just insignificant at the moment. The same truth can be seen in David's life. He was faithful in the ordinary events. He faithfully cared for the sheep. He lived in obedience to his father, and he didn't get much recognition. Okay, you look at it, and even his own family didn't even really, calling him in the lineup, they didn't even think of him. Okay, he wasn't doing it for great honor or to be seen of men, but he just chose. Whatever he did it faithfully. He stayed at it, and God blessed those things. And God chose David as his next mighty leader. 2 Chronicles 16:9 says, "For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth to show himself strong in the behalf of them whose heart is perfect towards him." And you think, well, I am doing all these things and nobody sees, or I'm not getting any recognition. God sees that. He's looking. What does it say? He's looking constantly for what? Them whose heart is perfect toward him. Okay, God's going to use you, and you may not see it. It may be through your kids, your grandkids, but you stay faithful. I just want to encourage you, as Ruth and Boaz did, as David did, stay faithful to God, and God will bless. God knows your heart. He's looking at those hearts who are perfect towards him. And you may see other people, and you think, well, they're not doing right, and they're getting blessed, and God's, blessing them, and maybe I'm wasting my time, but you'll eventually see the results and see the blessings down the road. But let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we love you, dear Lord. We just thank you for the fact that you have a plan for our lives, dear Lord, and help us not to mess that up, and follow you and do what's right. And we love you in Jesus' name. Amen. I just want to say one thing before you go. I was kind of thinking that God has a plan, and we still have sovereign will, right? And I was wondering I was thinking about how that works. I think God has a perfect plan for us, and I think sometimes we can get out of God's will and mess that up. I think God can't force us to do anything. I think He can whisper in our ear. Have you ever had somebody, we're going to do one thing?